Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward.
This week we are interviewing our friend Joey Gibson about Smalltalk because we got some feedback from him. I think he was indicating that there was maybe some yelling at the podcast while he was listening to it because
shaking fists.
we were getting some things wrong, and he wanted, and so we decided, well, if we don't understand it, why not go to a source and correct our
That's right.
correct our perceptions.
Well, and one kind of meta thing about our podcast is that it's working out great so far for when people have feedback that they want to convey. Great, come on. Come on to the show, and we'll discuss that feedback on an episode. It's been awesome. So thanks, Joey, for joining us and giving us your feedback and teaching us more about Smalltalk.
Right. So can you give us some background of, like, because you were involved in one of the Smalltalk projects, and I mean, just to give some context, I have had encounters with Smalltalk. The first time that
Close encounters?
What's that?
Close encounters?
No, kind
Just
of distant. I remember the first time I ever heard of it was the Byte magazine. They had this was back when they had these really giant, thick issues. And they had one which was all about Smalltalk, and it had this hot air balloon on the front of it. And it was just, Smalltalk everywhere. And I don't think I had enough understanding to be able to even grasp the language. But one of the problems was that it was so expensive to set up. But anyway, so tell us, just give us, how did you get involved? What was your background? Was it your first language, et cetera, things like that?
Well, no, my first language was BASIC in 1983. I was 13. I saved up my money and bought a Commodore VIC-20 and learned BASIC on it. So then 10 years later, I guess, actually, like 1993 or 94, I was in Salt Lake City providing some support for one of the teams in the company I worked for. The company I was at this old company. Most of the products were in Fortran and COBOL. And the first project I did there was actually porting some COBOL code from 1966 to the PC. So then all of a sudden I hear that there's this group in the company that's doing this thing called Smalltalk. And so I started looking into it, and I ended up out in Salt Lake City with them. And while I was there, I had a lot of free time. So I said, you know what, I'm gonna see what this is about. So I, went on the internet, which, wasn't really what it is today. But so I found there was a free Smalltalk. And so I downloaded that and I started playing with it. And I was talking to some of the guys in the group that, I was doing this, and they were like, well, if you're going to learn it, you should use a real one, the full environment, because this was just command line. It didn't have all the GUI stuff.
Was that Squeak?
No, Squeak didn't come about until 96. Okay. My memory is that it was GNU Smalltalk, but I looked up GNU the other day, and it didn't go. The history doesn't go back that far, so it was something prior to that. But he said, if you're going to learn it, you should do it correctly. So he says, we have an extra license for VisualWorks. Well, VisualWorks was the big one at the time, and it was $5,000 a developer seat, and they had a spare. So
Nice.
So when we got back to Atlanta, he gave me this box. It was, like a cubic foot of documentation, and a whole bunch of floppy disks.
5.25 floppies, or what?
No, these
3.5.
It may have had both. It may have had both. I can't remember. That was, again, 26 years ago, something like that. So I installed it. I started playing with it, and that's what got me started. It was.
Install though? What was your machine?
It was 386, 33 megahertz, I think.
Nice.
Which was pretty swanky at the time, but it may have been a 486 by then. I can't remember.
It was some IBM IBM compatible PC thing.
Yeah.
Not on the Commodore. I don't even know if you could
No,
run Smalltalk on the
no.
Commodore. It's just
To my
beyond the Commodore days.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there was never a Commodore 64 or anything Smalltalk. But
Because that was one of the issues with it, right? Is that it required a lot of resources. It's an interpreted environment. Is that
no,
correct?
it's compiled to bytecode, and there's a VM that does the bytecode. So it's just like, well, I say it's just like Java. I mean, it's a JITted
Huh.
VM based thing. But it does require a lot of resources because, like with most languages, you're working with text files and you've got an editor and, maybe you've got an IDE that's got some nice features, but it's still not huge, right? Smalltalk, on the other hand, you're working with an image that is run by your VM, by the VM. And the image is actually basically a freeze dried version of an object graph. And inside this object graph is all of your code, all of the system code, all of the windows and the browsers and all the editing tools and the debugger. It's a full system. You do
Wow.
everything in the environment, and your code lives in the exact same space with the code that makes the windows pop up. And it's a completely different environment. But yeah, it did have a lot of resource requirements.
So, how would you distribute an application?
So the way each vendor had different ways to do it, but the basic way is you would work in your image, and when you were ready to distribute it, you would do something called stripping the image, and that's you would basically set up I don't remember the exact term, but it was like a script, for lack of a better word, inside the image that would tell it which of your classes it should instantiate and run as the entry point. And then when you would run this stripping process, the
It would build
the
the whole DAG
right,
of
yeah,
execution.
it would go through and strip out everything that wasn't referenced in your code. So the browsers, the editors, the workspaces, all that stuff would get stripped out, and you would end up with a smaller image file that you could then you could run. Most of, like, I know with VisualWorks, you would have to, like, if I were to give it to you, I would give you an executable that was the runtime and then my image, and you would say, like, VW space my image. With the Smalltalk that I have the most experience with was a Windows based one called Dolphin Smalltalk, and it actually generated a .exe file that was everything you needed.
So, did that mean that I would have to have a Smalltalk um, installation on my machine in order to run your
No,
executable?
no, I would give you
It's like one
the execute
executable that has the whole IDE and compiler and your program all in it, huh?
right, and I could give you that full image, but if I were distributing an app, a program for somebody to use, the stripping process would get rid of the IDE parts,
Yeah.
and all
So
that
you
would
could
be
either
left.
give the dev executable or the release executable.
Right, yeah.
So, the say the $5,000 that you would pay per seat, did that include, like, if I want to distribute this thing, do I have to have special licensing or something?
Yeah, I think
Uh,
different, like, because the big ones back then. There was VisualWorks that actually came out of Park, which is where Smalltalk originated.
Mhm.
IBM
Palo
had
Alto
had
Research Center.
right, yeah. IBM had Visual Age for Smalltalk, which, if we want to talk about at some point, there's a really interesting history into Eclipse from that. Um, and then I think they all had their own licensing for distribution. So, like, just because you bought a developer license doesn't mean you can sell the product.
Right.
I wasn't on that side of it, so I didn't see it. But my memory is that it was you had to pay distribution licenses too.
So, how much of an impact do you think that all of that had on the uptake of Smalltalk? It seems like that was a lot of friction.
Yeah, I mean, you had to basically work for a company that had deep pockets if you wanted to do it, and it was it was really cool. And when people see it, they, are just blown away. I mean, if you think about Steve Jobs talked about visiting Park in the late '70s, and he said the three things that he saw these things and he didn't see anything else that they were working on. One was the GUI, and it was the Smalltalk GUI. The second one was the mouse, and the third one was PostScript. And he went away from that, and and I can't remember the guy's name, but he hired some guy away from Park and to go work on the Lisa, which that's from where we get the Mac and everything. But yeah, the pricing, $5,000 a developer seat, which just seems incredible now when
Well, if
most
you adjust that for inflation,
oh
like
yeah.
that'd be like what, $20,000 now or something? It's
Yeah, it's something ridiculous, and especially since nobody pays for developer tools anymore. And I say that, of course, I'm a paid subscriber to JetBrains for
oh yeah.
their full pack, but it's so cheap. It doesn't make sense not to do it. Um, but yeah, it charging that much for developer seats, you've got to either have a very small team or have a company that doesn't mind spending big money to get things going.
Yeah, everybody else would just say, let's spend $69 and get Turbo Pascal.
Yeah, yeah,
So
and
you were building UIs. That was really the only thing at the time Smalltalk was used for, right? Was UIs or
no, you could do. There was an object database. I think that was Gemstone at the time. I could be wrong on that, but the company I worked for, we had Oracle systems, and of course, it couldn't talk to Oracle at the time. At least I don't think it could. But the sort of canonical way to do databases was Gemstone. When
it's
I
like
worked,
client server style apps. So
yeah,
like
it's fat
like
clients, and yeah,
yeah,
yeah. There
data
it didn't do
engineering.
web, and um, yeah, but it was fat clients is what you were building.
Yeah.
So tell us what you liked about programming in Smalltalk. What made this a great experience for you?
Well, having all the developer tools, built in, you've got this idea, and I wish I could show you all these cool things, but this is an audio medium, so I can't really do that. But you have this idea of it's called a system browser. So from anywhere you can launch the browser, and it shows you all of the classes that are installed in the image. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of classes, and then you click on a class, and then in the next pane over, you see the protocols, and the protocols are just sort of an organizational thing. It's they don't really do anything other than convey information to the developers. And then you click on a protocol, and you can see in the fourth pane all of the methods that are in that. So you can walk, and then once you click on a method in the big pane at the bottom, you see the method source code, source code.
Mm.
And so you can get these browsers throughout the system. And in fact, you can do things like if you open a workspace, which is sort of like a scratch pad, and you can type code into it, and then you run it from within the workspace. So you can say like, my object space browse, and then hit the do it key, and it will open up a browser on your class.
Mm.
And then so you can, like all these objects know how to browse themselves, because everything, there are hundreds of methods defined on object, which is the basic root of everything, and everything has to be has to subclass from something. And if you go from object, then obviously you get all of these hundreds of methods, and it's things like browsing itself, and you can ask a class for. There's a method called all instances. So if you send a class object all instances, then it will return you a list of all of the live instances of that class that exist anywhere in the system.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Sounds a
which
little overwhelming.
it's well, it's cool. But yeah, it can be, and especially if you've never done OO before, which Smalltalk is the granddaddy of OO languages. So you know, we,
Well, Simula.
uh, The
But
the
Smalltalk was the first one that just like took it and really ran with it, I would
the
say.
the more well-known grandfather.
Yeah. The one that really popularized it, I would say,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So that's interesting because, well, for one thing, now when you say protocol, most people would see that as like an interface, right? I mean, or more or less of an interface.
Well, it's sort of poorly named. It's really just a classifier. It doesn't, like, you can't say, like in Java, you can say that a method takes an interface, and anything that implements that interface, you can pass it. It's not that type of thing. It's really just, um, for when you're in this browser, if you've got 300 methods defined on your class, you can just see all of them listed, in alphabetical order. But if you have classified them as what they're for, then like there are several that are just canonical protocols, like accessing. So your getters and setters will end up in the accessing protocol. And it's really just a way to filter the list for you as a developer to find what you need.
Okay. So most systems, object-oriented systems that have an object-based hierarchy, in other words, when you end up with everything has to come from a root class called typically object, that root class usually doesn't have very many operations. And you're saying that the Smalltalk root object has lots.
And even things related to the development experience, like being able to call .browse on any object, that's like tied to the actual IDE, which is also built into the. I'm sure you could browse the objects of the actual IDE too,
Oh
right?
yeah, totally. And you can change them. You can add methods to any class that already exists. So like, there's
Monkey patching.
exactly. There's popular tutorials, or a popular thing to have you do in a Smalltalk tutorial is add like um, a method to string, to do something like the one I saw the other day when I was sort of revitalizing my memory on Smalltalk, was adding a shout method to a string. And so you can say, hello world space shout, and it would uppercase it and add a bang at the end. And that, as soon as you add it, any string that exists anywhere in the system has access to that method. You can send any string that method at that moment. You don't
Yeah.
have to. It's not
It's
just
kind of
for
like
new
Ruby.
strings.
Ruby has that kind of
Yeah.
feature
Well,
too.
yeah, Ruby
Right?
was influenced strongly by Smalltalk. And then Kotlin has extension functions,
Yep.
which basically do a similar thing, but it's a little less Wild Westy. I mean, that's one of the things about monkey patching is that you're sort of, I mean, there's certain risks when you do that, and I think people discovered that more with Ruby than, I mean, maybe.
I think it's because with Ruby you can actually you could bring in a library that can override your toString method
Yes,
globally,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
or your hash code or whatever.
Yes,
Like can really do some crazy
yes.
stuff.
Well, and it seems like, I mean, could you do that with Smalltalk as well? No, I guess with Smalltalk everything was there all the time,
Well,
right?
I think you probably could, because there's a lot of stuff going on under the covers where you send a message to an object, and that method is sort of frequently referred to as a message selector. That basically it's going to use the name of that method to look up the actual code to run in a dictionary, somewhere under the covers. So it's really just a key into this dictionary, and so you ostensibly could just replace it if you wanted to, though it would probably be a very bad idea. I
Did it
haven't
have
tried it.
overloading, like function overloading, or was it just like whatever that name was, it was expecting these arguments and
No, you could overload functions. You could override functions, or I say functions; they're all methods. But
right?
it actually, one of the things that it does that no other language that I've seen does. So there's three types of messages you can send to an object. There's unary, messages, obviously. So like, ABS or factorial, which the integer class comes with a factorial method already in case you need it. There's binary, so, plus, minus, those things, which they are not operations. They're actually methods on numeric classes. And then they have these methods called keyword methods that are each part of it is like separated by colons. So like if you had like a color object and you wanted to get a color from it, and you had an RG, like in Java, you would have an RGB method, and you would, RGB left paren, and then the red value, comma, green value, comma, blue value, comma, or semicolon, right? In Smalltalk, you would have a method called R colon G colon B colon. And when you send it, you would say color space R colon, and then the value for your R, and then a space, and then G colon, the value for your G, space, B colon, the value for your blue, and then a period, because that's the statement ender is a period. So
like COBOL.
Yeah, exactly. It does have semicolons, so we can talk about what those are used for later. But yeah, so your actual values for the parameters are interspersed with the method name. So rather than having to keep it straight, what these parameters are, it's like right next to the thing that names it.
So like named parameters.
So yeah, like keyword parameters. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can kind of think of it that way. Again, I wish I could like just pull up a whiteboard and show you, but yeah, it's I always like that because it was a unique way to do methods.
So it wasn't dependent on ordering then, which is
it is dependent on ordering.
Okay, so
because the method name, like in this case for color, for RGB, it was the method, you actually pronounce it as R colon G colon B colon, and they have to be in that order, otherwise it's not the same method.
So my understanding of Smalltalk was that it was like purely object oriented. Everything had to be an object. And the way that you created new classes was you always had to inherit them from existing classes.
Yes. And in fact, to create a subclass, you send a method, you send a message to the class that you want to inherit from, telling it to create a new subclass. And so it's called subclass colon instance variable names colon class variable names colon package colon. That's the method name. But the beautiful thing, you don't have to remember most of this stuff, because if you click on it, you're in the system browser and you click on the class that you want to inherit from, one of the panes at the bottom is going to have a template for that method. So you just, fill in, change the values that you want to change. You put any instance variables or class variables that you want. And then when you execute that code, that class springs into existence, and you can start using it. You can start creating instances of it, and open a browser on it and start adding your code for what it's supposed to do.
Would you say that Smalltalk is like Lisp is to functions, Smalltalk is to objects? Like they're just like, this is our paradigm, and we're going to do everything within this paradigm.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Every single thing is an object. Numbers are objects. Down.
And the only way you can do anything is by sending a message to an object. Like that's the only way to do anything.
Yeah, and so like I mentioned earlier, like operations like plus, minus, divide, they look like the plus symbol, the minus symbol, all that stuff, but they're actual methods on types that understand them. So the ramifications of this is that the order of operations that most programmers have come to expect doesn't exist. So the order is unary messages, then binary messages, and then keyword messages. And when there's a tie, it basically goes left to right. So if you had an equation, you said, A times or A minus B plus C times X or whatever, it's not going to give you what you expect, because it's not going to do the multiplication first. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's going to do it left to right.
Not mathematical precedence, but like you said, it's urinary, binary, whatever precedent.
Right. And then the keywords. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that can be surprising. if you have a some sort of formula you're doing, and it's like, why am I getting the wrong value? Oh, it's because it's doing it in a different order.
So is every method polymorphic, or do you have to tell? I mean, like in C++, we have virtual functions, and you say this is or this isn't. In Smalltalk, is it's just like, yeah, if you've got a method, it's always going to have dynamic binding.
Yeah, there's no type information. So you tell it your method. You just tell it that it takes a something, but that something really can be anything. You don't say it has to be a something of this type. So if you try to send a message to something that doesn't understand it, then there is a method defined in the class object called does not understand that takes the name of the thing you were trying to send it. So what happens in the development environment is if you try to do this method call, then eventually, it'll try to find that method in the thing you called it, the receiver that you sent it to, and then it'll start working its way up the inheritance chain looking for it. And if it ultimately never finds it, then it will call this does not understand method that pops up a window, drops you into the debugger and says, you see the full stack trace.
This is why I thought it was an interpreted system, because all of the stuff you're describing sounds very runtime dynamic stuff going on.
But the way that they could do it is because your IDE is built into your object graph.
Right. But that leads us into is that the error model does not understand?
Only for that case. It has exceptions. You can do. Much of the language is built around blocks. You have a block of code that can, it's anything inside square brackets is a block or a closure, and they're lexical closures. So you can, create a block and then, tell it to do something, and you can specify different. Smalltalks have slightly different versions, but there's usually like an ensure keyword. You can say, if that block fails, ensure is like a finally. It says do this block, and then regardless of if it works or not, do this other block of code inside this ensure clause. But then there's also like an on : do : which says, if I get this exception, then do this block. And there's cool things you can do too. Like if you get an exception, you catch it, and then you can do things like you can say, I just retry it. You can mutate the state and have it retry it. You can say retry it, but with this block of code that's going to do something else. It can get kind of hairy, but so it gives you a lot of options.
In your own programming experience, we've been looking into error handling, more on this podcast, and it's been
our title is Happy Path Programming.
Happy Path Programming, right?
Error handling a lot.
So, and I've been struggling with it for quite a while, just kind of going, and one of the things that I've come across is that the original ideas that people had were a bit ivory tower, like exceptions in general. The idea is that it's something you can recover from. And it turns out that doesn't happen very often. It's like, oh, well, if you try and do some IO and it fails, well, yeah, just try it again. But then there's a lot of things that are different kinds of errors and not recoverable through the exception mechanism. But we have this sort of universal exception mechanism, and that's what everybody uses. And so it basically gets misused. So with these kind of clever other things, how often did you find yourself using those?
I don't know. It's been a long time.
It has, yeah.
Some of them, like there's a resignal that's basically like a rethrow. So you could say, if you catch this exception, throw this other one. The retry and the seems like, if you can mutate the environment somehow, like if
to fix it.
Yeah, or maybe you just want to try a couple of times. So you set a counter for how many times you've tried it, and then you retry it, and then once you hit that, whatever your limit is, then you resignal or you just, quit, return something else.
And that's often, I mean, that's usually something that's outside of your control. You're going, oh, some IO failed. I wonder if I tried it again,
Yeah.
maybe it'll work. But if it's
Right.
inside your program, you probably messed something up in your programming, and so that's not really an exception state. It's a programmer error and should
Yeah.
be
And
reported
you,
in a different way.
right. And you hope that the debugger will catch that,
Hmm.
while you're working on it. But, if it
Hmm.
escapes, then you get sort of an ugly dump. And if you've stripped
Well,
the image,
you've stripped the debugger out of your image,
right.
right, for
Yeah.
production.
Yeah.
So, and you've programmed a lot with Java, right?
Yeah. I started with Java in 1995.
Okay. So, how has knowing Smalltalk influenced your uh, Java programming style?
Um, well, with the first version of Java's collections, I was constantly pining for Smalltalk's collections because they were way better.
Oh,
Um, Smalltalk was when I saw the lists that it had and the fact that you could, instead of having to, for I equals 0,
yeah.
the C style of iteration of a collection, you could say, because Smalltalk collections have these methods that should sound familiar when I tell you there's collect, select, detect, reject, and inject into. Um, Mats took those names directly into Ruby, and I think all 5 of those are still there. Um, but
Huh.
yeah, so you could say, collect is just map, right? That's what we know it is today. Um, and so being able to transform a collection by just passing a block to this method called collect, I was like, that's so cool. And
So
then
they
so
were
now,
doing like function based transforms on collections long before like I ran into them in Scala. It was the first time I
yeah,
started doing that
yeah, and yeah, so
because you could easily have a closure that you
right.
passed to those. Yeah.
Yeah, you just pass a block in, and it, if you've just got a collection, then you get a variable bound to each bucket of the collection, and the closure can do whatever it wants, and then the result is, um, however it transformed each of those buckets, it's a new collection of those values.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
there's select, which is filter. There's reject, which is a negative filter, right? Um, and then detect just returns the first thing that matches your closure, and then inject into is a reduce.
Okay. Nice.
Well, so my own experience in talking to Smalltalk programmers when I was like working with C++ and with Java and trying to figure out, what do we do with these objects and how do they fit together and everything, was that people who had a Smalltalk background seemed to have a much better overview and big picture of how to design with objects than people who, like me, had started in C++, and my first sense of objects was figuring out what a virtual function was doing and then going, why are we doing this? Why are we going to all this trouble to have this dynamic binding thing? So I came at it from like the assembly language level up. And it seems like if you were coming at it from the Smalltalk perspective, I mean, I know Martin Fowler too, when when I started messing with Python, he goes, "Oh, well, I like Ruby because they have blocks," and
Yeah,
that's the direction that he went.
yeah.
So, how much of an influence do you think it had on your ability to design with, say, something like Java?
Huh. Well, I mean, I remember when I was learning about virtual functions in C++, back in like 91 or 2, and it was like I didn't fully it's like, okay, I understand inheritance and all, and if you, what is it? You create I just remember having a hard time understanding um, the oh, I just lost the word. The functions.
Instance?
No. Oh crap!
Member
How do I?
functions.
No, the virtual functions.
Oh yeah,
Um,
sure.
yeah, I just remember having a hard time understanding that, and you didn't have to worry about that in Smalltalk, and all the things with like. There's no difference between stack and heap. You don't have to worry about allocating space for the thing you're going to create, and you don't have to worry about cleaning up after yourself because it has full garbage collection. Um, and so, but your question was, how did that affect my ability to design?
Well, because the people who created the design patterns book, I think a lot of them had strong small talk backgrounds, and
The Gang of Four.
the Gang of Four, yeah, and I think some of the ideas came from small talk
Yeah,
for
and a
some.
lot of the examples were small talk too. And if you remember the Gang of Four
Yes.
book, there are a lot of examples in there that were small talk code.
Huh. Yes.
Yeah, so maybe I've had this campaign against the builder pattern lately, and I've been blaming Java a lot for it, but maybe I actually need to blame Smalltalk. Did you ever do builder pattern type stuff?
I
Maybe it looked
No,
great
I
in
don't
print.
think so. I mean, just because, um, yeah, I don't. I remember I've used builder pattern. I remember reading about it. I don't remember seeing it in Smalltalk code, but again, that was a long time ago.
Because I think the influence, kind of as you're saying, is that when you're dealing with a system where you don't think really about efficiency at all, because things like virtual functions and stack and heap, those are all efficiency issues.
Right.
And and look at what it did to the design of Java. Even though Java is all basically heap based, they still had the new keyword that they took from C++, which they didn't need.
Right.
And
And in fact, oh, sorry.
they also didn't want to they didn't want to have operator overloading because it was too complicated. But that complication in C++ is primarily because you have that stack heap dichotomy and you have to work around that. Whereas if it's all heap based and garbage collected, you don't have to think about it.
Right. And Smalltalk has new also, but it's not a keyword. It's actually a method. It's a method that you send to a class to tell it to create a new instance of itself. So it's on the right side of the thing you're creating, not the left.
Huh. Mm-hmm. So, how much of Java's design do you think was influenced by Smalltalk? Because I mean, that's one of the things that they said is that they wanted it to be more like Smalltalk.
Well, if they hadn't done primitive numbers and those stack based things, I think it would have been even closer. I don't know, some of the like the lame collections that we had early on, and maybe lame is unfair, but the less
No,
rich
no, it is
collections.
not unfair. They were really badly designed.
Okay.
They were terrible.
Yeah, I mean, single inheritance, which is what Smalltalk has, is there. Not doing multiple inheritance, I totally understand. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's kind of a hard question for somebody who wasn't in on the design process.
So you maintained some open source implementation of Smalltalk, is that right?
Yeah. So in 1999 or so, I came across this Smalltalk called Pocket Smalltalk that had been written some years earlier by a guy called Andrew Brault. And he had, released it into the world and then had moved on to other things, I guess. And there was another guy called Eric Arsenault who had done some work on it. He wasn't doing much with it then, and so I got it and started playing with it. And it ran on Windows, but it generated binaries for Palm devices, so Palm Pilot,
Wow.
which was the big thing at the time, and so the environment itself was written in Dolphin Smalltalk. So I went and got, Dolphin Smalltalk, and started adding to the environment. Well, the first thing I did was I wrote a full tutorial on how to build Palm apps using Pocket Smalltalk, and then I started adding to the environment. So like I built toolbars in on all of the internal windows, because this was a full Smalltalk environment, even though, your code, it was different in the code that you write didn't run on that platform, right? Because our target platform was the Palm, which was a ARM or whatever that processor was. But you did have an image, and it did have all of the developer tools built into it. We had browsers and workspaces and everything. So, but so I went in and I added toolbars, and then I kind of took, was the main guy doing work on it for a few years until, like, let's see, 2001. Eric and I went to Smalltalk Solutions, the conference in Chicago, and we gave an all-day talk, and that was a long day on Pocket Smalltalk. I think we had like maybe 30 or 40 people in the room with us for this 8-hour talk. And again, an 8-hour talk is a very, very long time.
It's a tutorial.
Yeah. So we walked them through basically the full environment, how to use it, what you can do with it. There was a Palm emulator you could download, and so you could build these, I think they were .swic font, like .swc, I think that was the extension, and you could load it onto your emulator and play with it before you actually put it on your Palm device. But I stopped doing that in the early 2000s sometime. Just sort of got bored with it, and nobody.
What's the relationship between Dolphin, Smalltalk, and Squeak?
So Squeak came out in 1996, and it was basically Alan Kay, and who was one of the original Smalltalk creators. I guess he was at Apple at the time. I know it's kind of a weird history, but so this group of guys took an original Smalltalk 80 image while they were at Apple and revived it. And then that work continued at Walt Disney Imagineering. And then it became Squeak. And Squeak is this cross-platform. Basically, it's Smalltalk 80, which was the first version of Smalltalk that runs on multiple platforms. Dolphin Smalltalk was a Windows only, or I say was, they still make it. They're up to version 7 now. I was looking at it the other day. It's Windows only. And like I said, it generates actual .exe files instead of, an image that you have to pass to a program to run it.
So what took you away from Smalltalk, and what do you miss about it?
Mostly time. I've doing, work for companies, and I was just doing Smalltalk in my spare time by then. I love the environment. Like I said, having all your developer tools built in. Of course, that does limit choice. Like now, like you couldn't pry IntelliJ and their tools away from me for all of the day job work, but other people like Eclipse, and other people like VS Code, and so you miss out on variety like that. You're locked into what the environment provides you. There have been some alternate browsers and things like that, but basically everybody does their work the exact same way. What else do I miss? Most, like, Java's catching up now in terms of like what the collections can do. I don't know. I had fun working in Smalltalk, whereas Java is not fun to me. It pays the bills, and I'm good at it, but I don't really enjoy it. Like Kotlin, I'm digging on Kotlin, and I'm really digging on Rust. But it's a different kind of fun than when I was working with Smalltalk.
So what sort of concurrency model do they have?
I wanted to go there too.
Good.
Thank you.
So there was basically, they had a method called fork. So you would create a block, and you would send it the fork method, and it would fork itself off into a thread. And then you could communicate between threads using a shared queue. So you would create an instance of this shared queue. And there was like a priority version of it too. So you could, have priority queue. And then you would just sort of like in Go, when you create a channel and when you have your Go routines, you pass, one end of the channel to each of the methods that need to, or each of the Go routines that need to communicate. You would do the same thing. So you would um,
So there
pass
was
this.
no shared memory. Like you couldn't like access the same object from different forked threads or something.
There wasn't. You could do some of that. There were semaphores and mutexes, so you could
Oh,
access um, uh, things at the same time, but it wasn't really like there was no concept of like the Java synchronized keyword. Um, if
so the emphasis was on communicating sequential processes,
uh,
CSP.
well, I mean, they would run concurrently. You could fork off, several threads, and
Well,
they
yeah, I mean that's the idea. So each one has its own process,
But
and the only
the
communication
coordination and
is this
communication was through.
careful, cued approach.
I don't know if that's. I mean, you the mutex is if the blocks are inside the same object, because blocks are lexical, so they can see everything that's come before them. So you could have two blocks in the same method that get spawned off in their own threads, but they can still see
The parent.
all of the instance variables from the object that created them. So that's why you would need like the mutexes.
Okay.
Um, and like the mutex, you actually, when you get, it's like the mutex, you say, here's this block of code, run it when I can.
Mhm.
Um, Rather than like the semaphore, which is just, you ask it, hey, can I do something? And you wait until it says you can. Um, but yeah,
So
you could.
I have this theory that object orientedness kind of we solve the major problems with object oriented programming when we started dealing with concurrency. That's when the model started to like break down, and functional programming is kind of like giving us a solution to those problems in that realm. Because that's what I've seen in Java and even in Kotlin yesterday. I was I was playing with vars to illustrate how bad using vars are, and I was like, all right, if a is not equal to null, then do this thing. And usually in Kotlin, because all I ever really use is vals. When you do that, Kotlin's like, oh, I can smartcast this thing to the non-nullable thing in your handler. Uh, but when I tried to do this on a var, Kotlin was like,
Nope.
"Oh, you can't smartcast it because
It
that
might
it might have
change between
changed
here and here,
between here
and
and
you
here."
don't usually think in those
Yeah,
terms, but you go, "Oh, you're right. It might."
yeah, and so I think like concurrency is the when we had to start doing concurrency, all of a sudden we realized, oh, this model is not going to work for what we need here.
Yeah, well, and certainly not in its current form.
Right.
Um,
Well, so you look at Pony, which I think is very inspired by Smalltalk and kind of like true OO of sending messages to communicate, but they have added the like Rust style way to control how information is accessed and mutated across message passing, uh, and do like a queue based approach and that sort of thing. So they to achieve, I think, to make OO work in a concurrent environment better, they've had to add some constructs around that.
yeah, well, my original question was: it sounds like yes, you can use semaphores and that kind of thing to guards, but the general, it sounded like they were pushing you towards using communicating sequential processes. The CSP model
Okay.
is like, okay, you got a process over here, it's running completely independently, nobody can see it. You got another process over here. The only connection they have is this queue, and this thing can go, oh, I'll put something on the queue, and then when you want to, you can pull it off. But nobody can like push anything into anybody else. And it's sort of more what Go pushes.
Oh, Erlang, Akka.
Erlang, yeah, yeah, and it's like it's kind of, I don't know if proven is the right word, but it's kind of shown to be one of the safer or safest models for concurrency.
One of the only safe ways in object-oriented programming that you can do concurrency without foot gunning yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Foot
Mm-hmm.
gunning. Yeah. Yeah. And like you talk about, vals and vars, which, Kotlin, they want you to do vals as much as possible. Right. And we want to do that because immutable is, the safest thing. But in Smalltalk, is like there's no concept of that. Everything is mutable. No, if you have a class, then instance variables are private. You can't see them. You have to provide accessors. But and you could make an instance variable immutable by not providing a setter, but the object itself is still mutable. There's no concept like the var versus val difference.
Or final in Java.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like the model for objects is that the object kind of manages and protects its data, but there really wasn't a lot of thinking about whether this should be mutable or immutable.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas with functional programming, they're going, yeah, mutability is really an important issue, and we want this idea of,
we're going to make you feel shame if you make something mutable.
Yes, and you do. I mean, I feel like, oh, this is a puzzle I have to solve. How do I make everything immutable? Because I know it's possible, and now I want to do it. And if I end up with a var, I feel like I've failed.
Yeah.
And your editor will color it differently. And
yes,
I think when I was working in Scala years ago was the first time I saw that, when like vars were like red or something. It's like, why is that red? That looks like an error.
It's a shame. It's shame. Yes, it's the red badge of shame.
Right.
Interesting.
So, well, other than the development environment, do you miss anything about the way
syntax or programming model?
Yeah, any of that stuff.
Community? Was it just always full of nice people in the community?
Yeah.
Community. It was kind of small even back when I was in it. I mean, like when I first got into it, the internet was still fairly new, and so communities weren't really a thing like they are now. It was mostly like forums and message boards and that kind of stuff.
And the entry fee was $5,000. So,
yeah. Now, GNU Smalltalk still exists, and Dolphin now has an open source version of their version 7. You can download it from GitHub, so you can get into it cheap. And VisualWorks, which is owned by Syncom now, they have a personal license, which I used to have a personal license for it years ago. But I hadn't in years. But to get a personal license now, you have to like fill out this web form, and it says it could take up to 24 hours. And I tried last week to get one and still haven't heard anything. So ostensibly, yeah, yeah, ostensibly you can get it for free, but I couldn't on that one. But
I had heard that there was some Smalltalk based like web server that uses continuations, something like that.
It's probably Seaside,
yes,
which I haven't done anything with, but I know it exists. I just haven't looked at it.
So my homework is going to be, I'm going to try to get a Seaside app running in Docker on Google Cloud Run. That's my homework.
Of course you are.
Just to see it. I've never done Smalltalk. I got to try it.
So the Smalltalk I've been working with the last few days, just after we talked, I wanted to refresh my memory. So there is a descendant of Squeak called Pharo, Pharo.
Oh yeah, I've seen that, but they didn't say it was. Did they call it a Smalltalk? I thought they said no. This is a different language.
I'm sure they did call it that,
Okay.
but it's because they basically forked Squeak, and they've tried to modernize the UI, which it's still, I mean, if you run it on a Mac, it's still kind of jarring because it doesn't look like anything like a Mac, what your Mac windows are supposed to look like. But it does look better than Squeak, which still looked like Smalltalk 80, graphics. But they've tried to modernize it some, but the language is still the same. There's Git support now, which is interesting. Um, but so I would recommend, if you really want to play with it, get Pharaoh, because I'm pretty sure that Pharaoh and Seaside are somehow related. Maybe it's the same people or something. I'm not entirely sure on that, but I'm fairly certain. But Pharaoh is a great place to start.
Okay. Check it out.
That's
Pharaoh, Seaside.
that's the one you would recommend.
Yeah, and it's free, so if you get a Smalltalk 80 book, you'll probably be able to do the examples. But they have, if you go to, I think it's books.pharaoh.org, they've got links to like 20 something books on like Smalltalk in general, and there's one Pharaoh by example that's really nice. Walks you through using all the developer tools, and it's a little out of date. Some windows have changed a little bit, and you may have to, noodle over things a little bit, but it's generally a good introduction to fairly modern Smalltalk.
So I'm going to take a cue from one of the Python podcasts I listen to and say, like, just for you personally, like, what editor do you use, and do you have any favorite? And this doesn't have to be Smalltalk oriented. It's just like, what do you work in on a day-to-day basis, and what editor you use, and do you have like some favorite libraries that you think are really well designed?
Well, I do mostly Java for the day job.
And is that, what version of Java is that?
Oh Lord, we're on Java 8.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
You and the rest of the
which,
world. So
Yeah.
it's
well,
okay. You're not alone.
it's like I heard the other day something about Java 15. I'm like, oh my God, is it really up to that now?
And
Um,
even then, is that one that you pay attention to, or do you wait for the long-term support one, which is that 16, or is that,
yeah,
I don't even know, because they're just putting them out every 6 months.
Like most
yeah,
large companies, somewhere in the company, somebody is thinking about Java versions. But
yeah, maybe. But yeah, so we do Java. We've done some Go within the company. Um, but so let's see. So I work in IntelliJ mostly. Um, I
so
buy I personally buy the whole the all tools suite just because it's inexpensive and they're so good. And
so good.
um, I do Rust mostly in my free time, so I use Sea Lion with the Rust plugin.
What's Sea
The
Lion?
Sea Lion is their C and C++ development environment. You could
Okay.
do it. You can load the Rust plugin into IntelliJ, and I used to do that. I used to use like IntelliJ for everything, but now lately I've started using IntelliJ just for Java and Kotlin, and then I'll use the specialized IDEs. If I'm working in Ruby, I use RubyMine and
Which
Golang for Go, and
Yeah, I've done the
um,
same thing as you. I always just load plugins into IntelliJ. I haven't used the specialized versions.
Yeah, I changed. I mean, for Python, I use PyCharm. Just
yeah, it's a little lighter weight, and there are things that aren't Java specific, in there. It's like, well, there is no class path in Python. I don't, why is there a field here to set the class path? It doesn't matter. One of the things that I love is a font, which it seems strange to say that you're in love with a font, but it's this font called Fira, Fira code. And it's, a free TrueType font. But the thing that I love the most about it is it has programming ligatures. And so this is like if you're typing, and you have to enable them, and like in all the IntelliJ or the JetBrains products, they have when you set this font, there's a checkbox that says use font ligatures. You have to turn it on, and so it has special symbols for different things. So like if you type,
Like the
bang,
amount
like what?
the anonymous function, like dash greater than or equals greater than or whatever, becomes like an arrow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, if you type bang equals, then you get an equal sign with a slash through it, like, we used to
That's
see.
cute.
And stuff like arrows, it converts, like the less than dash into an actual single glyph that is a nicely styled arrow. And, but it's still under the covers. It's just a display thing. I mean, if you look at the edit, if you look at the source
The
file in
actual text.
VI, then
Yeah.
you're still going to see the less than minus, unless you have font ligatures set up there too. But it's a beautiful font. It's
But more
I
beautiful than JetBrains Mono, because I love JetBrains Mono.
yeah, I change it as soon as, I mean, nothing against JetBrains Mono, but I've liked Fira for a few years now, and so it's my font for everything.
Nice. What do you think of Cargo? I've heard such good things about Cargo.
Cargo's nice. It uses Toml. Um, it uses Toml, which you mentioned on a
Wait, tell
previous
me what
episode.
Cargo is.
Cargo is the package
Oh,
manager for Rust.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay.
And
Sure.
Toml's so good.
yeah,
So
it's Cargo is not just the package manager; it's the build tool. So I mean,
yeah,
you can say Rust C, and compile this code, but most
Cargo
people
run.
don't. Yeah, you just run cargo build, and you can say cargo build minus minus release, and it does a release version, um, which is like fully optimized. Which I had a program I wrote recently, and when I ran this like benchmark on it, the performance was just terrible. And then I recompiled it with the minus minus release, and then it was,
Like,
orders of magnitude faster. So it's like whatever they turned on was a good thing. But yeah, so you have a TOML file where you list your, some things about the build, and then all your dependencies and the versions, and it fetches them for you and
they should have
does your
used
build.
they should have used DAL instead of Toml, but hey, Toml's better than YAML and JSON. So
I
and
hate YAML.
certainly better than XML.
What's doll? I haven't heard of that one.
That was
Are
the
we
feedback we got
sure that
on.
we're bought into that? Because that seemed like the getting people up the curve on that could be very challenging.
Yeah. So in our episode on declarative languages, where I launched my campaign against custom declarative languages, somebody in Twitter was like shouting "doll, doll, doll" at us in response to that episode. So Bruce and I went and checked out doll, and it's really interesting because one of the things that we don't like about declarative language, or I don't like about declarative languages, is you hit the wall, there's no escape hatch, and doll has it. You still have a wall, but I think that wall is a lot further back than with Tom.
And it's clearly defined by design rather than just running out of steam, which a lot of these things seem to.
Yeah.
It says, we're doing this for a reason.
Yeah.
And I like that. But the pure functionality of doll, I think, unless you're into that, that could be a steep learning curve for some people to set up their build systems.
Yeah,
it's got
so there are I think 2 build systems that are using doll for the language now, which is interesting. But I have not done enough exploration on doll and using it for a build tool to have much opinion on this.
You mentioned about hitting the wall with the declarative language, and I remember when I listened to that episode, I listened to your show when I'm running, and of course I'm like yelling things out, and passersby don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But so
it's a crazy person
it's
yelling about
because the things that you're yelling
languages as they
would
run
just
by.
be like he's got some weird form of Tourette's syndrome.
Yeah. But I was thinking
computer thing.
Yeah, I mean, I walk down the street yelling, "Effing builders! God, they should all die." People are looking at me like weird, but.
So you were talking about Gradle in that episode, and like I've been using, I used to use Ant a long time ago, and then I've been using Maven since like 2008. So for me, Maven is like the way to go because I understand it, I can do what I need to, and I've tried to get into Gradle. I tried again after listening to your show on that, and there's just parts of it that just still feel inscrutable. But I completely agree. Your point about when you hit the wall, you hit the wall of what the declarative part can do or what the built-in stuff can do, and just being able to, you're already in the language, just write, Groovy code or Kotlin code or whatever. I hadn't really thought about that before, because I've just, when I've looked at it, I was like, well, why would you want to do this in Groovy? Why not just declaring what you want and let the builder figure it out seems like much better. But I hadn't really thought about that case, because back years ago in Maven, I had to write, plugins for our Maven build that did stuff that it wasn't supposed to do, and it just wasn't any fun to do.
It's not any fun. Well, and what I've done a lot in Maven is you can actually, through a Maven plugin, pop in ant script into your
Yeah.
Maven build file.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, there's my escape hatch, but oh, it feels
It's
so
to
terrible.
ant.
It feels so terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that felt
It's
dirty.
easier to go into a full blown plugin, but
Yeah, it's still, I don't think any of us are happy about any of these things. It's still a second class citizen. So
yeah.
it doesn't get the care that it needs, which is why cargo is nice, because it's like, oh, it does what you want it to do without forcing you to go through a lot of gyrations.
The best build tool is the one we don't have to do anything for.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that was fun.
Yeah.
I learned a lot.
I learned stuff.
Thanks, Joey, for joining us, and thanks for the feedback.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And we'll see you maybe whenever the next Winter Tech Forum is, which might not be till the summer.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed it's in the summer.